So now that we've had an introduction to the history of biological evolution, let's talk about the pace and patterns of evolution that we see in our world. The first thing to note is this general evolutionary trend toward greater and greater complexity. Here is a figure that represents on the x-axis millions of years before present. So here is today, present day, Earth, going back in time as we move to the left. And so we have some of these most primitive animals on Earth are sponges, the porifera. And notice the y-axis is in cell type number, meaning how many cells are contained within one organism. And we have this nearly linear trend when we're talking about grouping at a pretty high taxonomic level. Porifera is an entire phylum, Cnidaria is an entire phylum, so is Arthropoda. Aves is a class that includes the birds. But by and large, we see this general trend in increasing cell type number going from about 600 million years ago to today. But why is this? And you can peruse the literature, and a number of researchers have over many decades explored the potential reasons behind this trend that we observe. And I'll walk through a couple of them. So more parts might allow greater diversification of labor among those parts. And since this greater division of labor will confer an evolutionary advantage, evolution naturally favors a continuing rise in complexity as measured by count of fundamental components. Also, we have the explanation of increasing diversity leads to greater complexity among ecological habitats. So the more and more complex organisms evolve, the more complex those ecological niches that they inhabit become. Therefore, there's this positive feedback between organisms and their environment. And then something along the same lines here, evolution into an ever-increasing ecospace will confer a continual growth in complexity. So obviously there's great support in the idea that this may increase complexity. But, and I have to throw this in there, it is not generally accepted that this is, something that was a force of nature or a direct result of natural selection pushing in the direction of complexity. We have other researchers, lots and lots of other researchers who are on the other side of this argument and saying that, well, sure, this represents natural selection because it's sort of a random walk away from the immutable barrier of simplicity at the lower extreme, meaning this is the most obvious and uninteresting explanation because we understand that life started out very, very simple. So where else would it go except to develop to be more complex? And so in that way, it's kind of like, well, duh. And there are a number of research papers dedicated to exploring the idea of this inherent need to be more and more complex and rebutting it, saying, well, it's sort of just random how that turned out because we started from something so simple. But whatever we think the general trend is, what we can do now is take a look at the patterns of species diversity on Earth. And the specific examination of the study of the distribution of species across space and time is called biogeography. We can take a look at the map of the Earth here for patterns of vertebrate species diversity, with lowest vertebrate diversity represented in these cooler colors and higher species diversity in terms of vertebrates represented by these warmer colors here in reds and oranges. And you'll notice the geographic distribution of vertebrate species diversity seems to be the warmest in color around the equator. Most notably in the Amazon rainforest here, we have lots and lots of vertebrate species diversity. We have so much species diversity in this one region in particular that it's often referred to as the cradle of life. And one of the biggest outstanding questions about why this area is so fertile for biological diversity is, well, what were the environmental conditions that allowed this diversification to happen? We have different understandings and hypotheses of what may have led to the hotspot in the Amazon rainforest for biodiversity, but the jury is still out on how it became to be known as the cradle of life. We can take a look at evolutionary trends in taxonomic diversity. And as you will remember from previous lectures, taxonomy is just naming things. We can take a look at how we have really exploded in the different number of named things that we have going from back in time to today. And the number of orders is represented here on the left y-axis. And you'll notice that we increase our diversity a whole lot as far as named things when we move from the distant geologic past into the present. The same is not only true for animals, but plants as well. Here we're representing the taxonomic richness of vascular plants only in the northern hemisphere. We have pteridophytes, which represent our fern species. We have gymnosperms, and then finally we have angiosperms. So some of these tend to decline through geological time, but for example, our angiosperms, they really pick up in taxonomic diversity in our recent geological past. We also have the observation of trending and increasing body size. This is a graph here that represents a rough estimate of the maximum size of living things at different times in the history of life. Note that both of the scales, the X scale and the Y, are both logarithmic. We have the present represented here, and as we go back, we are going back in time. So moving from bacteria to cyanobacteria, myxobacteria, our first eukaryotes, trilobites, all the way up to modern day plants and animals, you'll notice that we increase in body size. This sort of trends along what we were discussing in terms of increasing in biological complexity, but this phenomenon has a specific name, and it is called Cope's rule. Cope noticed that there was an evolutionary trend within lineages toward increased body size over time, taking, for example, specifically the horse biomass. So going back to about 60 million years to today, across this one discrete lineage of horse, we identify through fossil evidence that the horse has increased in body size. So this is just one example of Cope's rule. We can also look at bivalves during the Jurassic. Remember that bivalves are our clam species that are represented in the phylum Mollusca, with each line here representing a different species represented as a distinct fossil. We notice that going back in time through the Jurassic period, we see an overall trend to increasing body size in bivalves. There are a couple of explanations. First has to do with intraspecific competition. So intraspecific competitions means competition among individuals within a lineage. So here again, we need to refer back to etymological roots, or the different parts of words and what they mean. Intra means having to do within something, and inter is across something. And I remember this easiest by remembering that interstates take you between states. Okay, so intraspecific competition among individuals within a lineage would perhaps favor those specific individuals that are larger in body size within a lineage. In addition, interspecific interactions among individuals from different lineages might also cause a directional trend toward a larger and larger body size. This is what we refer to as character displacement. So displacing the small body size in favor of a large body size. But again, we need to ask the question, how does this hold up? Does it make sense? We can turn to our good old friend Stephen Jay Gould, who was not a fan of the inextricable march towards increasing complexity through evolutionary time several slides ago at the beginning of this talk. Likewise, he was not a fan of Cope's rule. He understood this to be a psychological artifact. And he writes in this brief News and Views article here, according to a law formulated by E.D. Cope in 1871, the body size of organisms in a particular evolutionary lineage tends to increase, but Cope's rule has failed the most comprehensive test yet applied to it. We had no direct laboratory evidence to support Cope's claim. What's interesting is that a modern paper that you guys will be assigned to read actually married Cope's law to a different rule called Bergmann's rule to understand how ostracod species increase their body size because of temperature. And that's an exciting story, and we'll get to talk about that later. When we're talking about body size of organisms, we have to talk about insular dwarfism and gigantism. These are known to occur once a population becomes separated from the mainland and displaced onto an island. That's why it's called insular. Here we have on the x-axis body size of populations on the mainland, increasing going left to right. And then here the relative importance of forces promoting either dwarfism or gigantism. So at this dashed line, the size remains the same. But over here, when we have immigrant selection, intensified intraspecific competition, so between populations, and ecological release from large competitors and predators, something that originally had a smaller body size, once it gets to an island separated from the mainland, is going to increase in its body size because of these different ecological forcings. That is what is known as insular gigantism or island gigantism. Conversely, if you were a large organism on the mainland and you were part of a population that got displaced to an island somewhere, if you were faced with ecological release from predators, intensified intraspecific competition, and resource limitation and specialization for insular niches, you would go from a large body size to a smaller body size. This is what is known as insular dwarfism or island dwarfism. What we mean by ecological release, that just occurs when species don't have to deal with a problem that they would have had to deal with on the mainland, such as a predator or source of competition. So this is a phenomenon known as insular dwarfism and gigantism, but we're most familiar with insular dwarfism with woolly mammoth populations. We have dwarfism in isolated island populations of woolly mammoths. These woolly mammoths have been found to be as small as 4 feet in locations of the Aleutian Islands. So the idea is as they moved away from the mainlands and got trapped on these islands, there was pressure in their environment to become smaller and smaller in size. And the tendency of small herbivores to enlarge and carnivores and ungulates, so hoofed animals, to dwarf on islands, quote, seems to have fewer exceptions than any other ecotypic rule in animals. And this was recognized several decades ago. There are a couple of hypotheses, some of which we've already brought up. Number one, competitive release or ecological release in small animals leads to natural selection for increasing body size. So no longer do you need to compete with those around you. You now are free to increase your body size. And then on the flip side of that, resource limitation for larger animals. What is the best way to reduce the amount that you need to intake? Just get smaller. So this resource limitation on those isolated islands led to selection for smaller body sizes. So next we need to ask the question, how is the process of evolution by speciation related to the diversification of phenotypes or the way things look? Evolution by speciation is also called cladogenesis, and we'll get to talk about the difference between cladogenesis and something else called anagenesis in a few slides. But first, let's talk about Darwin's idea of gradual change. Here is the only figure that was published in The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin in 1859. It's also found in your textbook in figure 1811. And this was his view of gradual change within lineages over many generations. So within a specific node, you would have multiple branching off points. Some of those branching off points would then themselves branch off, so on and so forth, until you had something that looked kind of like a tree. So his idea is that you had trait or character changes that are occurring along the branches along the way. Now, there is an alternative hypothesis to the pace of how character changes occur, and that is what we call punctuated equilibrium. Punctuated equilibrium was first proposed by Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge in 1972. This idea of punctuated equilibrium presents two parts. Number one, it presents a claim about the pattern of change in the fossil record that we observe. Also, it presents a hypothesis about evolutionary processes. The pattern that was observed by Gould and Eldredge is that little change in species over extended periods of geological time, followed by rapid change in one stable state to another. So they called this punctuated equilibrium because they identified in the fossil record specifically long periods of stasis in body form, shape, and size, or morphology, punctuated by rapid changes in character state or how something looked. Their hypothesis is that characters or traits evolve primarily in concert with true speciation or cladogenesis. If new species evolve primarily in marginal or smaller populations, not part of the bigger main population, then the transitions within those smaller populations are almost never going to be observed in the fossil record. And that is why we have this state of punctuated character change. And so these are largely considered the gradualism and the punctuated equilibrium. They're largely considered two alternative views of the process of diversification among species. So first, let's talk about gradual evolution. This is when we have all the character change that's occurring within a single lineage. In ideal circumstances, a species would always stay the same forever and ever and always because their environment wouldn't change. But we live on Earth and we understand that Earth changes all the time and environmental conditions change, so species have to adapt to them. Once these changes reach a tipping point, we then might say that species A becomes species B, even if they appear to be very similar to each other. So the defining feature of anagenesis, which is what this is called, is the absence of branching that we see in cladogenesis. The original species does not die off, but over time it simply dissolves into a new species. So this is what we mean by character changes along a lineage. So species A goes extinct when it becomes species B goes extinct when it becomes species C, so on and so forth. So all of the character change is occurring within a single lineage. It is called anagenesis. One of the primary examples of anagenesis or gradual evolution is the evolution of the horse. Remember a couple slides ago, we were talking about the increase in body size of the horse. Well, that increase in body size is directly associated with the generation of new species. And this horse started off its evolution as a small, unassuming mammal. It was in the genus called Eohippus about 50 million years ago. This means dawn horse. It was short, somewhere between 10 to 20 inches tall. So just in your mind, compare that to the horses that we have today. One of the most distinctive features is that it had legs and 5 toes instead of the hoof that we have in our modern horses. So admittedly, the front feet had only 4 visible toes, with one of them being vestigial that didn't touch the ground. So it is a byproduct of evolution where it's no longer needed anymore. Its hind feet also had 2 vestigial toes that it didn't serve much of a practical purpose, like many of the vestigial organs and parts we see in animals, including ourselves. And so over tens of millions of years, a long chain of horse species connected this Eohippus ancestral species to the modern horse that we know today in the genus of Equus. Another example of gradualistic evolution can be seen in trilobite species. Here we have a study of different Ordovician Welsh trilobites. These scientists counted the number of ribs found on the trilobite skeletons, and each little line here represents one lineage of trilobite. And so tracking through time with a general younging direction, meaning down here, the rocks are older, and up here, the rocks are younger, these scientists noticed that within a single lineage, there was a gradualistic evolution towards more and more ribs for some of the species, maybe not so much for this one here. So that is another example of gradualistic evolution. Next, let's discuss punctuated equilibrium. This is when all of the character change is directly associated with cladogenesis, or evolutionary splitting into 2 distinct species. So here, most evolution happens through cladogenesis, or what we would call cladogenesis. And during cladogenesis, one species branches off into 2 or more separate species. So the example given here is that we have a common ancestor between the giraffe and the okapi, splits off into 2 directions, where we have the evolution of the giraffe occurring on the right and the okapi occurring on the left. We can take a look at what this looks like in a cladogram, and it is represented in this way, with increasing morphological diversity spawning out from the left and the right, time represented along this axis here. And as we go through time, we increase the amount of morphological diversity because of these discrete branching off points. So in cladogenesis, it's not mandatory for the parent species to die off. Oftentimes they can be coexisting in the same time and space. There might be some competition that arises, but in most cases, a geographical obstacle is responsible for creating a division that separates these 2, preventing these 2 distinct populations from interbreeding. We call that allopatric speciation, and we'll get into specific mechanisms of speciation in future lectures. Another example of punctuated evolution is seen in the skeletal morphology of bryozoans. If you're not familiar with what a bryozoan is, here's an image of a bryozoan on the bottom left. It kind of looks like a moss ball, but they are marine creatures who have a long history in the fossil record, and scientists can study their skeletal morphology and determine that they are showing the diagnostic characteristics of something that's undergone punctuated equilibrium or punctuated evolution, with long periods of stasis in body form and then abrupt changes that we can identify as distinct and discrete species. So this is what the 2 models look like side by side, with the example of butterfly patterns on wings. On the left, we have the gradualism model. On the right, we have the punctuated equilibrium model, with morphological change represented along this bottom axis here. So in terms of the gradualistic model, along a single lineage, we have gradual change occurring until eventually we can identify that this species looks different, and we can identify it as a separate species from the ancestor. At some point, we have a different branch sprouting off from this main branch that results in a different wing pattern that we again can identify as not only distinct from this sister lineage, but also the common ancestor between the 2. By contrast, in the punctuated equilibrium model, we have the common ancestor who goes on to live its life as a distinct species, but along the way, we have a splitting where this wing pattern goes on to eventually be identified as distinct enough from the ancestor to be considered a different species. And then another speciation event occurs here, where again, we have a very different wing pattern that can be easily identified as different from the ancestor. This is what it looks like when we're talking about change in the fossil record. We have time on the x-axis here, change on the y-axis here. When we have equilibrium, we don't really have too much change happening in terms of body shape or characters that make up an organism, because there's perhaps no change in the environment, so there's no reason to adapt. What we see in green is the quote unquote short period of quote rapid gradual evolution. What we mean by this is that's about 10,000 or so years. It's not millions of years, but it's certainly not rapid in terms of how biologists think about rapid things. So rapid here on a geological timescale is about 10,000 years. And so what we see as this macro evolutionary event brings us back to a new equilibrium and is represented as a sudden change in the fossil record. So in truth, we probably have both gradualism and punctuated equilibrium happening simultaneously, and we have evidence for both in the fossil record. And this is what it would look like in our fossil record in terms of mollusks, for example, or our gastropods, our snails. So we would see in the fossil record long periods of stasis where we had the same body form, same body type, a rapid change, and then all of a sudden we have the preservation of a different body form that we would identify as a different species. You can learn more about this snail example in the TED Ed video that is named Punctuated Equilibrium, and it just goes through the different stages that would result in that fossilization record. We do have several examples of long-term stasis in many lineages, some living, some extinct. Specifically, we can talk about invertebrate examples like the horseshoe crab. They've had little morphological change since the early Triassic. So for 230 million years, this horseshoe crab has not changed in the way it looks. It hasn't changed its body form or morphology at all. Long periods of stasis. Likewise, the nostricans, the tadpole shrimp, they too have had little morphological change since the late Carboniferous. So even more time has passed, 305 million years old. There are 2 Triassic forms that are assigned to living species. So not only did they arise about 300 million years ago, they haven't changed in body shape in all of that time. In addition to invertebrate examples, we also have some vertebrate examples of long-term stasis. This animal here is called the pangolin. They're very cute. They have these spiny scales, but they are mammals. See its cute little face. But there's only 7 living species on Earth right now, one of which dates back to the early Oligocene. So 35 million years have passed, and there's been no morphological change in this organism. In addition, we also have examples in the sturgeon that we have living on Earth. There are 2 living genera that extend back to the late Cretaceous with little morphological change at all. So for about 80 million years, the sturgeon have had the same body plans. So lineages that show high levels of morphological stasis also tend to show very little diversification by speciation, meaning that once a lineage is there, it's there for a very, very long time without a speciation event. They seem to lack both anagenesis and cladogenesis. So both that punctuated equilibrium associated with cladogenesis and the gradualism associated with anagenesis. So here's a question for you that's located in your textbook. So now that you know the differences between punctuated equilibrium and gradualism, taking a look at this example here with the birds. So here in A, gradual speciation, species diverge at a slow, steady pace as traits change incrementally. So here we have our founder species, and we have change through time. By contrast, in punctuated equilibrium, species diverge quickly and then remain unchanged for long periods of time. So here in our founder species, we immediately have a speciation event with rapid change in our body plan, followed by long periods of stasis where that body plan might change ever slightly. So which of the following statements is false? Punctuated equilibrium is most likely to occur in a small population that experiences a rapid change in its environment. Punctuated equilibrium is most likely to occur in a large population that lives in a stable climate. Gradual speciation is most likely to occur in species that live in a stable climate. Or gradual speciation and punctuated equilibrium both result in divergence of species. I believe the correct answer would be B. Punctuated equilibrium is most likely to occur in a large population that lives in a stable climate. That is probably false, because if it lived in a stable climate, it would be more subjected to the forces of gradualistic evolution rather than punctuated equilibrium, which has the hallmark of rapid environmental change as the driver. This brings up a question. How can we explain this long-term evolutionary stasis? Does it mean that these lineages simply lack any type of genetic diversity that would spawn new species? Studies have been done to address this question specifically, and we can take a look at the molecular genetic analysis of two arthropod groups. So number one, here we have the morphologically stable horseshoe crab that we've already talked about. And then number two, the morphologically diverse shelled crabs that we live with. We've got everything from our crawfish to Dungeness crabs. These two arthropod groups have very different evolutionary histories on Earth and in the fossil record, but surprisingly, they demonstrate that both lineages have similar levels of molecular genetic variation. So it's not for lack of having genetic diversity inside of their genomes, it's just there's really perhaps been no environmental selective pressure to change body plan or body shape. Species are capable of rapid diversification. This is an example pulled from the Drosophila lineage. Drosophila contains our fruit flies. And this idea of rapid diversification is tied to adaptive radiation, which we will get to talk about in future lectures. But for now, I just want you to appreciate that we can observe this today, taking a look at the different Hawaiian islands, with the younger island, the big island here, containing more recent lineages. And as we go back in time, we go back to the oldest island chain, we have more ancient lineages of our Drosophila. So this brings it back to biogeography and understanding how species can rapidly diversify once they are separated from their ancestral populations. Phenotypic traits, or traits that are visible to us with our eyeballs, may show dramatic changes with little underlying genetic change, surprisingly. This is my favorite example. This is called the axolotl, and this is a type of salamander. It's also called the Mexican salamander. This Mexican salamander has a specific ability to retain juvenile traits through adulthood. It is called neotenic because it retains the juvenile form while it is an adult. This is not due to underlying genetic change. The genome is exactly the same. It's just changes in hormones and signals within the body that tell it to take the adult shape or the juvenile shape. And as you can see, it is really adorable. It looks like a mudkip. It has gills on the outside of its face. I love the neotenic salamanders. You should ask Dr. Dave Unger to see his in his lab because he has one.
This is an axolotl, also known as a walking fish, but it's not a fish, it's an amphibian. The axolotl reaches adulthood without undergoing metamorphosis. It is basically a perpetual teenager. Instead of developing lungs and move on land, it remains in the water at larva stage, breathing through its feathered external gills. It is a unique survival mechanism because if outside of the water is too dry to survive as adult, it is better to remain tadpole that requires a lower quality and quantity of food. It rarely mutates into a terrestrial salamander, only in case of overpopulation, lack of water or oxygen. To then resemble the tiger salamander, their close relative, is native from a small region southern Mexico City, and due to urbanization and consequent water pollution, its conservation is in danger. Another incredible quality of this species is the ability of regenerate. If injured, they are able to grow back without any scars, limbs, spinal cord, and even parts of the brain. It's a proven key to stem cell research, and they may yet hold the secret of growing artificial organs and other medical developments that today only exist in science fiction.
So which is it? We can take a look at the fossil record and laboratory evidence to understand which is true, gradualism or punctuated equilibrium. We have evidence in the fossil record and laboratory evidence for both punctuated equilibrium and gradualism.